You took a quiz, which was an open notebook quiz on the 7th of January. I wanted to go over these. There were different sections. The first section, this was the feedback is broken down by elements. So for the biology standard SB6c, the element deals with common descent of ancestry evidence. Now, I'm going to go through the questions, show you where to find the information that we have discovered or should have discovered on assignments, and also kind of give you some tips and tricks on these types of questions. So, the first question here, about 96% of the information in human DNA is found in gorilla DNA. Which evidence supports this statement? So I'm going to take you back to the history of life lesson that you did a while back. In this particular example that's in the text, remember we should be writing down a lot of different notes. And this chart is kind of important whenever they give us a chart. So along with the chart, we need to make sure that we read what it says and write down something that might be important. So the focus on biology and evolution is common ancestry. So look at this. Consider the example in the table below. The table shows how similar the DNA of several animal species is to human DNA. Based on these data, which organisms do you think shared the most common recent ancestor with humans? And then it gives us similarity of DNA. So this question is very similar to that, and it's all about common ancestry. So if we look, humans evolved from gorillas. No biology teacher or scientist that knows anything is going to say that a human just popped out of a gorilla one day. We're not saying that, and I've never said that in class. We look at this answer C: as gorillas evolve, they will become more similar to humans. We haven't made that statement. It's not been in any of your text assignments. Gorillas and humans are too different for meaningful genetic comparisons. Not true. They've got a genetic comparison up here, which is very meaningful. So this one, gorillas and humans diverge from a recent common ancestor, is the correct answer and goes along with the nature of the element and what we're trying to help you to understand. The second question about embryology. The diagram shows the embryo development of four vertebrates and suggests all of the following except. So remember, when you see this, you're going to go through each one and say, is this statement true or false? And in this case, we're going to choose the false statement as our answer. But I want to go back to where you saw this or should have seen this and should have read this in the assignment Comparative Embryology. So reading this, comparative embryology is the study of similarities and differences in the embryos of different species. Similarities in embryos are evidence of common ancestry. We just keep seeing this over and over. All vertebrate embryos, for example, have gill slits and tails. Most vertebrates, except for fish, lose their gill slits by adulthood. Some of them also lose their tail. In humans, the tail is reduced to the tailbone. Thus, similarities organisms share as embryos may be gone by adulthood. This is why it is valuable to compare organisms in the embryonic stage. So I'm going to go back to my question. I'm going to go through every single one of these and say, is this true or false? So does this suggest common ancestry of vertebrates? That's true. Remember, common ancestry, common ancestry, common ancestry. I'm going to skip B. I'm going to look at statement C. There are very few differences in the early development of any vertebrates. So if we look here, that is not true, because look at all the similarities between these different vertebrate species as they are progressing through the embryonic stages. Look at D. Common features, gills, and segments in the embryos of all vertebrates. Well, definitely, all vertebrates embryos have gill slits and tails. So all of those statements are true, but look at statement B. There are no similarities in the embryos of all four groups. That statement is false. Number one, because that was in a reading that we talked about. And number two, you can just see it right here that it's false because they look very, very similar. Let's take a look at the third and final question of this element. A donkey and a beetle both use legs for locomotion, but the donkey has an internal bony skeleton while the beetle has an exoskeleton made of chitin. Which of these statements accurately describe the relationship between the donkey and the beetle? We're going to choose all that apply. So remember, when we see choose all that apply, we go through every single one of them and say, is this a true or false statement? When the statement is true, we're going to choose that. So let's go back to where we talked about this, learned about this in the CK12 text on comparative anatomy. Let's read this. Comparative anatomy is the study of similarities and differences in the structure of different species. Similar body parts may be homologous or analogous. Both provide evidence for evolution. Homologous structures are structures that are similar in related organisms because they were inherited from a common ancestor. These structures may or may not have the same function in the descendants. Figures below show the hands of several different mammals. They all have the same basic patterns of bones. They inherited this pattern from a common ancestor. However, their forelimbs now have different functions. So these are homologous structures. Now, I know that we keep talking about common ancestry. There's a distinction here between a recent ancestor and some ancestry that is very distant. So in homologous structures, they're inherited from a common ancestor that has the same functions. So notice what humans, cats, whales, bats, we have the same bones. We have the radius, we have carpals, these are our wrist bones, phalanges, these are our fingers or our toes. Now let's look at what an analogous structure is. Analogous structures are structures that are similar in unrelated organisms. These structures are similar because they evolved to do the same job, not because they were inherited from a common ancestor. For example, the wings of bats and birds shown in this figure look similar on the outside. They also have the same function. However, wings evolved independently in the two groups of animals. This is apparent when you compare the patterns of bones in the wings. So notice that when it comes to analogous structures, both bats and birds, they do have wings and their function is to fly, but they do not have the same pattern of bones here that would suggest that it was brought down through generations. Okay, I know that may be a little bit difficult to understand what the difference is, but notice that if we are comparing homologous structures, a lot of times you're going to have questions that show you highlighted bones, which are the same. They have just been maybe reduced, elongated, like reduced in the case of the wrist bones, elongated in the case of the phalanges, shortened, like the humerus is very short in a whale. So when you're looking at analogous structure questions, they might show you a structure, but notice that the bones are not the same. Okay, so the bats do not have, or excuse me, the bats have these phalanges, but we're not seeing phalanges on the birds. So they're similar in what their form and function is, but they didn't come down through a lineage. So let's take a look at the question again. And remember, we're going to go through each one and say, is that statement true or false? So these organisms have homologous structures and therefore have a recent common ancestor. Okay, the beetle and the donkey. if you think about it, these two are really not closely related. A beetle is an insect, it has an exoskeleton. A donkey is a mammal vertebrate that has an internal skeleton. So, this is a little bit higher thinking level question. Yes, it's not straight up word for word from a text. That's what makes it a level maybe 3 question, because you have to think about this. All right, so would these be homologous structures? No, because they are not the same bones. Okay, we are not talking about a humerus in both a donkey and a beetle, or a carpal or a wrist bone in a donkey and a beetle. These are totally different things. Okay, they both use legs for locomotion, but they're they're not showing you a picture that this leg bone is exactly like this leg bone. So this is an untrue statement. Okay, the DNA sequences for these two organisms will show 99% homology since they both code for legs. Okay, again, this is using homology. It's saying that they're passed down through the same lineage. Um, and so that is going to be a false statement. Okay, again, it's not something that I can point to and say this is word for word. It's a thinking type of question, which is why it's a little bit higher level. So both of these would be false statements. We would not pick them. All right, C, the legs of these organisms are analogous to structures and do not represent recent common ancestry. Well, it's true, both donkey and legs use these legs for locomotion, but there's big differences between them. Okay, so that statement is true. Um, C is true, so we would check C. D, the organisms share a recent common ancestor because the legs of the organisms are vestigial structures. Well, remember, vestigial structures, we talked about this. I'm going to go back down and read what a vestigial structure is. Structures like the human tailbone and whale pelvis are called vestigial structures. Evolution has reduced their size because the structures are no longer used. The human appendix is another example of a vestigial structure. It is a tiny remnant of a once larger organ. In a distant ancestor, it was needed to digest food, but it serves no purpose in humans today. What do you think the structures that are no longer Why do you think the structures that are no longer used shrink in size? Um, so, a vestigial structure is something that is no longer used. So, it's tiny. And we cannot say that about the legs of either a donkey or a beetle. Both donkeys and beetles use their legs. So D is a false statement. We're not going to choose it. All right, the donkey and the beetle do not share a recent common ancestor because the legs of the organism have a common purpose but not a common structure. So that is a true statement there. They do have a common purpose, which is for locomotion, um, but they do not have a common structure. And it tells you right here, but their structure is completely different. So the answer to this is going to be the legs are analogous, C, and basically the definition of analogous, common purpose but not a common structure, E.